Welcome back. ISIS reportedly brought in nearly $1 billion last year. The U.S., of course, wants to cut off the group's funding, but how to do it? Joining me right now in a Fox Business exclusive is the Secretary of the Treasury Secretary Jack Lew. Mr. Secretary, so nice to have you on the program this morning. Thanks very much for joining us.
Great to be with you, Maria. Happy holidays.
And to you. I know one of the headlines that we want to get to is end of year and New Year financial resolutions. I was reading your op-ed earlier, and I love the way you said about retirement and savings. You've got to have a savings account, personal savings, Social Security, and then one form of pension. So we'll get to that in a moment, Secretary. But let me begin with this story on ISIS. $900 million is the expectations that this terrorist group brought in last year. And you said you've got to go for the financing and cut off their funding. Secretary, how successful have we been so far, and what do we need to do?
So, Maria, ISIL financing is critically important to get at. Just last week, for the first time in history, finance ministers from around the world sat in the UN Security Council, and I chaired a UN Security Council session where we passed a resolution committing the world to both treating ISIL like we do al-Qaeda for the purpose of sanctions, calling on all countries to adopt the toughest rules to control financing, and making even middlemen, not just those who deal directly with ISIL, but those who deal with people who deal with them, subject to sanctions. We need to get at the root of their financing. Let me tell you something about ISIL. They started out conquering territory and seizing banks, stealing money from banks. That was a sinking fund that they spent. And then they built on top of that a source of oil revenue and extortion, taxing people, but really under terms that we wouldn't consider normal taxation, under pretty severe penalties of non-payment. And what we need to do now is go at all the sources of funding, the renewable ones, not just the stolen money from banks. With oil, we're doing much better. We have targeted not just the sources of their oil, the refineries, but the trucks that move oil to the border for sale. Just in the last month and a half, we've taken out around 400 tanker trucks. We're dealing with oil, I think, quite effectively. We've cut ISIL off from the international financial community. But we have to be clear. They also sell things like cement, and cement doesn't go across borders in trucks that are marked ISIL. It takes a lot of scrutiny to make sure that you're not doing business with ISIL, and that's why the UN action last week was so important. I mean, ISIL has some liabilities. They control a lot of territory and a lot of people. That means they need a continuous source of revenue. If we can start to diminish that, which we've done, we make it harder for them. So people shouldn't think of this as the money is on or off. If we make it harder and harder for them to get the money they need, then they can't grow and they start to shrink, and we're in a much better position to take them on militarily.
Yeah, I saw you at the UN last week, and I thought, it was a successful move in terms of getting other countries to recognize how strong they have been financially and get in this fight. But let me ask you, I mean, apparently they've got banks in Raqqa, among other places, right? They own banks. They have an oil ministry. Now they have a passport-making machine to get passports and try to infiltrate into the West. What do you make of that? I mean, how did they get that passport-making machine?
So, Maria, we worked with the government of Iraq to shut down around 60 banks in ISIL-controlled territory. They are being cut off from the international financial system. So what they're doing locally is not connected to the international financial system. That's an important point. In order to replace their arms, in order to do the things that they need to do to operate as an effective bureaucracy in the area they control, they need access to the international system. I'm not going to say that they don't have ongoing sources of funding. That's why the session at the UN was so important last week. They have proven themselves to be creative and capable at some of the kind of quasi-governmental activities. But they also have taken on enormous responsibilities, which mean they have to keep bringing more and more revenue in. We're going to make it harder and harder for them to do that. And I think that the fact that the United States and Russia jointly sponsored a resolution that was passed unanimously at the UN Security Council makes it clear that this is an international, not just a U.S. commitment.
Do we know who's buying their oil on the black market?
So, there is a lot of informal oil trade historically in the region. So we have stopped the formal flows to a considerable degree. When I have talked to people in the region, they say you have to think garden hoses, not just pipelines. Oil flows through things that are not what is the normal industrial infrastructure. That's why the tanker trucks are so important. That's one of the main means that ISIL has used to get foreign currency in, by having anonymous-looking tanker trucks. Removing those tanker trucks from the road will diminish their ability to sell oil outside of ISIL-controlled territory.
Really
but we have to keep up. They can replace trucks, and we have to make sure they don't get to do that.
Yeah, absolutely, Secretary.